Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Guys at Magic. This is Hunter coming at you alone this time. I just wanted to make a quick video talking about the new dungeon mechanic that Wizards of the Coast has announced for the new set from Magic the Gathering, Dungeons and Dragons, Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. They just announced this mechanic along with a couple new cards that take advantage of the mechanic, but I just wanted to go through, give you some of my thoughts on the mechanic and what the mechanic does itself. So without further ado, let's go ahead and first start off by looking at some of the dungeon cards themselves while I talk about what the mechanic does. So the dungeon cards themselves do not go in your deck. They actually start outside the game and end up in the command zone for a little bit. If you're playing in a tournament or something like that, when they say cards from outside, that usually means going in your sideboard, but dungeons don't work that way. They actually don't take up any sideboard slots. They just kind of hang out with the sideboard, but don't take up a slot. So whenever you do enter in a dungeon, that just comes in, sits in the little command zone, and just you move about the rooms of the dungeons itself. The way dungeons work is similar to how sagas work, except you do need a card that says venture into the dungeon. If you have a card that says venture into the dungeon while you're not already in a dungeon, you go ahead and just put it in the command zone, and now you're in the dungeon, ready to start your journey. As you enter a dungeon, you're actually going to put a marker on the first room that you enter into. That is not a counter, so proliferate, stuff like that, that enables counters to be doubled and stuff, that will not have any effect on any of the dungeons themselves. So let's just take Lost Mine of Phandelver, for instance. You start off by going into the cave entrance. It says scry 1. You take that action. Whenever you venture further into the dungeon, you can either take the left side, which is Goblin Lair, or the right side, which is Mine Tunnels. If you take the left side, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. If you take the right side, you create a treasure token. It's completely up to you which path you take. After that, let's say you take the Goblin Lair side. You can take down to Storeroom or Dark Pool. Or, if you went from Mine Tunnels, you can go down to the Dark Pool or the Funky Cavern. Storeroom states put a 1/1 counter on a target creature. Dark Pool states each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. Funky Cavern, target creature gets -4, -0 until your next turn. And finally, the final room after you deal with any of those three rooms is the Temple of Dumathoin. That says draw a card. After that, you've completed the dungeon. It moves out of your command zone. And if you ever go back into a dungeon, you can pick any one of these three at any point of the game. You cannot enter multiple dungeons at a time. Once you pick one dungeon, you're in it until it's completed. So let's look at Tomb of Annihilation. This is another dungeon card. You start at Trapped Entry. Each player loses 1 life. You can go to the left side, which is Veils of Fear. Each player loses 2 life unless they discard a card. And then go down to Sandfall Cell. Each player loses 2 life unless they sack an artifact, a creature, or a land. And then finally you get down to the Cradle of the Death God, which is create the Artropple, a legendary 4/4 Black God horror creature token with Death Touch. Or if you went down the right side, you just go into one room, which is the Oblite. And that is discard a card and sack an artifact, a creature, and a land, and then finally go back down to the Cradle of the Death God. And finally, you have the Dungeon of the Mad Mage. That is a crazy looking dungeon. It will take up the most time. Yawning Portal, you gain 1 life. Next room, dungeon level, scry 1. Do you want to go left or right? If you go left, you go Goblin Bazaar, you create a treasure token. Or you go right, you go Twisted Caverns, you target creature can't attack until your next turn. Either one of those dungeons go down to the Lost level, which is a scry 2. From the Lost level, you can go left, which is Runestone Caverns. That's to exile the top 2 cards in your library. You may play them. On the right side, if you went down from Lost level, it would be Mulral's Graveyard, which is create 2/1/1 black skeleton creature tokens. From either of those rooms, the next level is Deep Mines, which is Scry 3, and then finally you get to Mad Wizard's Lair, which states draw 3 cards and reveal them. You may cast one of them without paying its mana cost. These are the only 3 dungeons available in the entire Dungeons and Dragons set. They did announce there were going to be more in the Commander sets themselves, but as far as standard goes, these are the 3 dungeons that are going to be allowed in standard. A lot of the times I believe people are going to try to get through dungeons very quickly, which the fastest is the Tomb of Annihilation. If you want to do it quickly, get out of a dungeon fast. There's a bunch of cards that I'm about to get to that specifically state venture into the dungeon. I think this is very interesting new mechanic. I like how you can't interact with counters. It's not a counter, it is a marker, because if someone was to proliferate, or let's say you get a Vorinclex in the turn, you start with double counters, you're already 2 rooms in, it would be very overpowerful, especially with some of these cards doing some of the things that they do. It could get very hectic. So let's go ahead and get into some of the cards that they did announce alongside the dungeons. That first one being a new legendary creature, which is a Dragon Knight. Its name is Nadar, Selfless Paladin. That is 1 white, 2 generic mana for a 3/3. It has Vigilance. It says, whenever Nadar, Selfless Paladin, enters the battlefield or attacks, venture into the dungeon. Other creatures you control get +1/+1 as long as you've completed a dungeon. Again, this is a card that is very heavily involved with dungeons. If you want to complete a dungeon very fast, we do, again, look to that Tomb of Annihilation from before, but they're really pushing this new dungeon theme. And I think you're just going to have to build a dungeon-themed deck around the cards if you're looking to build anything with these new cards. They are very specific. Overall, if you're just looking to put this card in a regular deck with the standard meta that is in right now, ultimately it's a 3 mana 3/3 Vigilance that can do additional things whenever it enters or attacks, depending on the dungeon that you pick. As soon as it comes into play, you can scry 1, each player loses a life, or you gain a life. Very cool. I think people might be able to build around this and make something very scary. Let's just move on to some of the 2 commons that they also announced today. It was Shortcut Seeker, which is 1 blue, 3 generic mana for a 2/5. It says, whenever Shortcut Seeker deals combat damage to a player, venture into the dungeon. Again, really heavily on these dungeon cards. And then we also have Gloomstalker. And Gloomstalker is 1 white, 2 generic mana for a 2/3, and states, as long as you've completed a dungeon, Gloomstalker has double strike. Now what's interesting about this card is that it automatically recognizes that you've completed a dungeon. Doesn't matter what point of the game it's at. If you play this late game, it comes in, it says, you've completed a dungeon, I have double strike automatically. Doesn't need to be there for when you complete the dungeon. A lot of these cards can do the exact same thing as well. And finally, the final card I wanted to talk about before I end this video is Eliwick Tumblestrum. That is the new legendary Planeswalker. It is 2 green mana, 2 generic mana. It starts with 4 loyalty counter. Its +1 ability says venture into the dungeon. Its -2 ability says to look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. If it's a legendary, you gain 3 life. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And finally, its ultimate, it's -7. It says you get an emblem with creatures you control have trample and haste and get +2/+2 for each differently named dungeon you've completed. So ultimately, it can get a +6/+6 and have trample and haste if you've completed all 3 dungeons. in the game. It's going to be very difficult, I would say, to complete 3 dungeons in one game of standard or one game of modern. I don't see it happening. So maybe at most you'll get +2/+2 with trample. I would say I think it would take too long to venture through 3 different dungeons to get that ultimate to really pay off. So basically you would just be looking at her +1 ability just to venture through dungeons, and also a good engine to scry and draw a card that you needed. So that's it. Let me know what you guys think about this new mechanic. This is the dungeon mechanic in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. I think it will be interesting to see how people build around it. There's always going to be those people that build around it. It's personally not my cup of tea. We will get into it later when we talk about our spoiler videos. Spoiler season starts next Monday. Cannot wait. We will be doing videos again. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Comment down below, again, what you think about all of this. Until next time, this is Hunter with Guys That Magic. Peace.